Hi, good evening, everyone. Everyone, look at all of you. Thank you for your patience and for wanting to come out and be here and be present and do this with us. We're so thrilled and honored. I'm Kelly Montana. I'm the assistant curator at the Menil Drawing Institute and the curator of the exhibition that gathers us together tonight. Before I begin, I'd like to remind everyone to silence your cell phones, please. Double check, please. We are recording this talk and it will be posted online in the coming weeks. I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation between Art Spiegelman and Rebecca Rabinow in conjunction with our current exhibition, Si Lewen, The Parade. Following the program, the exhibition will be open over at the Menil Drawing Institute for a public reception, and we hope that you will join us. We are especially grateful that Art could travel from New York to be here with us tonight. There will hopefully be time for a short Q&A following their presentation, but we may go long. If that's the case, we trust that you can hold your questions, and in any ways, please hold them till the end of the presentation. The Menil Bookstore will have a select number of signed copies of Si Lewen's Parade, an artist's odyssey, including the limited edition available. This book is a reissue, there it is. This book is a reissue of the artist's parade drawings alongside a focused look at Si Lewen's art, handsomely published by Charlie Kochman at Abrams Books in close collaboration with Art. We also trust you understand that Art will not be signing books as part of our celebration this evening, nor taking photographs, and we thank you in advance. Special gratitude is also due to many members of Si Lewen's family who traveled from all over the country to be here with us tonight. One of his daughters, Nina, is with us this evening, and her husband and sons, Lewen's grandsons, also nieces, nephews, grandnieces, and grandnephews, and a circle of the artist's friends. And it is such a deep honor to celebrate Si Lewen alongside you all. So thank you very much for coming out. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Art Spiegelman. Art is a cartoonist and a comics artist, editor, and advocate. Notable highlights of his career include founding the alternative comics anthology Raw Magazine with Françoise Mouly, contributing cover art to The New Yorker for a decade, authoring numerous books, including Mouse, A Survivor's Tale, which earned him a Pulitzer, Mouse 2, and Here My Troubles Began, as well as In the Shadow of No Towers, and many more. A retrospective of his art opened in 2011 and traveled extensively across Canada, Europe, and the United States. What brings us together tonight is Art's stalwart advocacy for comics and comic literacy. He has taught and lectured on the subject extensively, and in his passion for the history of the form that introduced the Menil to Si Lewen's tremendous art, and his wordless novel, The Parade, in particular. Drawings that speak to the cyclical nature of war and violence, a message as potent today as it was in 1957 when the book was published. His tale is a haunting one, grounded in personal episodes of his life and history he witnessed, anti-Semitic violence in the United States, World War II, and the Holocaust, while also evoking a prismatic lens on atrocity across time and place. It's not hard to see why Art Spiegelman became a great admirer and friend of Si Lewen. Mouse shares with the Parade an attunement to the complexities and nuances of human suffering, with an unflinching look at the Holocaust and its generational afterlives. Their stories contain devastating portraits of the ways people and communities hurt each other, with resolute and caustic warnings that a fear of difference, an elevation of authoritarianism, and the suppression of irreducible narratives cannot articulate a future different from the horrors of our past nor of our present. There is so much that comics, graphic novels, and narrative drawing have to teach us about vision, memory, storytelling, and more, and that's why we're here tonight. Please join me in welcoming our guest this evening, Art Spiegelman, joined by our director, Rebecca Rabinow.
You don't even get any
I know, but thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry for those of you who are standing. I hope it's not too uncomfortable. We're grateful that you're here. And if you give up the ghost at some point, this lecture is being taped and you can watch it online. So thank you for staying with us. for as long as you can. I don't know if Dominique de Menil ever saw Lewen's book, but the de Menils certainly championed the ideas contained within it. Their advocacy for human rights and world peace led to the creation in 1986 of the Carter-Menil Human Rights Foundation, which promoted the protection of global human rights. The image that you're seeing on the screen was taken in 1991 when the prize was given, and the figures standing include Nelson Mandela, Dominique de Menil, Jimmy Carter, Governor Ann Richards, and Sebastian Guy Parabal. Dominique de Menil believed that we all have the agency to make a difference in our world. And when she received an honorary degree from Loyola University in 1990, she told the students, and I quote, "Days might come when you will feel discouraged, tired, worthless. If such days do come, remember that the world needs you. The world is in deep trouble, and everyone's contribution counts. Of all of the values, none is more precious to me than the commitment to truth. Without the commitment to truth, there is no freedom. Without the commitment to truth, we become slave to lies, to injustice, and finally, to terror." These are the ideals that are embodied within Si Lewen's book, The Parade, which was published in 1957. For those of you who haven't had a chance to walk through the galleries yet, to give you some sense of what you will see and what we'll be speaking about tonight, it's an exhibition of the original drawings that were made and reproduced in this book, all 55 of them, plus additional works of art that ultimately didn't make the cut. And they are installed sequentially. So you begin and you walk around the room in a very cinematic way. Lewen is able to convey all sorts of things. There's a parade. It's a military parade. People are cheering. Children are on their parents' shoulders. A dog is running down the street. After the parade, the children play soldier. They dress up with hats and sticks as guns and parade around. And then all too soon, they're called to actually become soldiers. They enlist, and their families go through the wrenching horror of being separated from their children, who become very soon soldiers, who are asked to fight on the battlefield. As you go through the exhibition, you'll turn a corner, and you go from this point of enlistment to destruction. Lewen was looking at artwork that was made by many people during his time, and he's able to convey bullets and explosions, body fragments flying through the air, death, genocide, and imprisonment. As the book nears its end, finally, there's relief in some sort. The war ends, and to celebrate, there's a parade. And then, if you walk through it again, you realize the end is just the beginning. This is a book that captures Si Lewen's lived life, but it's also timeless and placeless. It's a story about the cycles of war, which sadly are just as relevant today as they were when Lewen created it. So, I was introduced to this book by Art Spiegelman, and it has been a journey and a pleasure to get to know Art. I should warn you that whenever we're together, even if we make an appointment to last 40 minutes, 2 hours later, I'm looking at my watch, realizing I'm late. So we're going to try to keep to our schedule. But Art, tell me a little bit about how you met Si.
Wow, with an introduction like that, I can't tell you, it's just too long a story. But I got to know Si and his life because of a project I was working on called Wordless, which was trying to show a certain genre of picture stories that had no words but told a story in pictures. They became very popular right around World War I. When Si was a young kid, for his bar mitzvah, he got a copy of a book by a guy named Franz Masriel, who was important to him and a generation later important to me. And I just assumed he was dead. Like, I was looking at the dates that he was born and just figured, well, I don't know how to find out how to do anything with this very obscure book that came out in an edition of 1,000 or so copies in 1950s. And then looking around the internet, God bless, there was a Si Lewen Museum somewhere in Pennsylvania. So I called them and said, who do I talk to about the rights to Si Lewen's parade so we could show some of it in a kind of visual lecture with music, patter, and whatever at the Sydney Opera House that had commissioned me to do Wordless, that then traveled eventually. And said, I don't know, you'll have to ask Si. So gave me the number, I called Si Lewen, and within minutes we were doing exactly what Rebecca and I do, which is talking for hours on end. And I was delighted with him. I said, look, we don't have much money, we can only pay you an honorarium. He says, no, I don't know if I'll be alive to see the show, but you can't pay me any money because you understand art. Art is priceless, which means it's voitless. But I don't want to turn it into a commodity. So I couldn't pay him anything, but I did go down to visit him as soon as I could, and we really did become friends, which is great for me because, you know, as I'm getting older, it's harder and harder to find father figures. And I can't say he was a father figure. He's more like a funny uncle, probably even to his kids. But nevertheless, we bonded. And I can tell you that it was a great pleasure to know him in the last few years of his life.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about his life?
Okay, so he's a Polish Jew. He fled from pogroms after World War I. He was born 2 days before Armistice Day, so he has passed through World War I and World War II and all the wars that came after till now, till recently. Basically, his house had gotten burned down, his mother's house, because she was the granddaughter of the wonder rabbi of Lublin, and it was just after World War I, and they realized they should get lost because being a Jew in Poland at that time wasn't a good idea. So they emigrated to where they'd be safe, Germany. And so he basically was a lonely kid in Germany. He was getting beaten up for being a skinny little introverted Jewish kid. He was lonely, but he liked going to the museums with his parents. His father was it's an oxymoron, he was a famous Yiddish writer. And they would spend a lot of time at museums like this one. And afterwards, they would ask him how he liked what he saw. And he said, it's great. Like, I love talking to the pictures. I just wish they could be displayed closer together so they could talk to each other when I'm not here to talk with them. This became an operating system for his life's work. That picture I showed before was a picture he did in a sanitarium when he was 4 years old for tuberculosis. He was the only kid there. They gave him paints to keep him busy, and he came back deciding he'd be an artist. This was from his first show when he was 14 years old in Berlin. His father had a lot of friends who were artists, and they were giving him lessons. This is called Workers in the Snow. It was the most popular picture in his first exhibition when he's 14 years old, and it sold. And so, you know, he doesn't seem to be a very practical man in many ways, but he did know enough to paint it 5 times and sell them all as the original. So he was launched to a successful art career, basically. Unfortunately, that's when Hitler came to power in 1933, and Si and his older brother decided this was not a good place to be, and although the parents stayed behind, they both fled to France and then were making a life there, working on farms and whatever. But in 1935, through a miracle that's too long to explain because then you won't get to the snacks till about 9:30 at night, but through a miracle, let's say, the entire family was allowed to move to America at a time where Jews were not being granted immigration rights at all. And they moved to New York, and first they really loved it there because for one thing, at the age of 15, he was able to study at the Studio School, the National Academy Museum and School near the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right across the street from the museum and Central Park. When he was finished with his lessons there, where he was studying with Achille Gorky, among others, he then would go to the Met, talk to the pictures for a while, and then wander through the park to the west side where his mother and brother lived. And as he walked across, there was this kind of lake, still is one, where you can kind of rent rowboats. And then one day he had a trauma that made America seem as dangerous as any other place he had lived instead of a kind of a resource for him. So what happened was he's wandering through the park near the lake, and a cop hears him talking, and they hear his Jewish German accent, the cop, and beckons him over, asks for his papers, takes the papers, and says, "Get in the boat." They get in a boat, they row out to the middle of the lake, at which point the cop begins pummeling him with a blackjack and said, "You don't belong here, you should go back where you came from," and keeps beating him on the back of his neck and then slapping him around, and then pulls out a gun, and Si was sure he was going to be killed at that moment. But then the cop says, "I'm going to let you go, but I know where you live, I've got your papers, so you don't tell anybody about this." So he was thrown, and then at some point he started screaming and screaming for help because of this gun. Nobody came to his aid. Nobody called any other cops or anything like that. So this is why people are now calling about defunding the police, which is not a great slogan, but there were difficult policemen then, as well as now. So he got so depressed from this that within a couple of weeks he tried to poison himself. He survived and went to a sanatorium, barely survived, but when he came around and was just not knowing what he was going to do with his life if he was going to keep living, he met the woman who sort of rescued him, Rennie, his beloved wife, for decades and decades and decades, and became the confidant of his life. But it took him many years before he could confess to this humiliating and horrible experience. So it was a trauma that helped shape him.
And so in this work was done later. It was done in 1952 called Sunday Bridge. But he had a habit, right, of going back and working through trauma through his art.
Absolutely. And this was made after the war, when all of a sudden his pictures got a lot lighter. Weirdly enough, instead of after having witnessed the results of Buchenwald 3 days after it was opened to outsiders, and all of the other experiences he had as a soldier, which I'll talk about again in a moment, but for here, his pictures were very bleak. And then after he survived and was in the VA hospital for a while, he said, miraculously, he expunged black from his palette. So he made this beautiful picture of the lake that he'd been almost pummeled to death in. And these pictures, his ones that were kind of post-impressionist, bright and likable, looked good on couches, was embraced by the MoMA and the Whitney, who would send them around in shows of young artists after the war, and he was on his way to actually being quite successful.
But let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to the war.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about the Ritchie Boys?
Yes. So he was an avowed pacifist, but he was invited to be part of a special ops force called the Ritchie Boys that recruited many Jewish, but anybody who could speak German well that was an American. And that meant that they could be used for translating when talking to prisoners, for writing propaganda and whatever. And he volunteered because of what he had experienced already in Germany, how important it was to fight, even though he was a pacifist. He was also an atheist, but he's the most God-fearing atheist I've ever met. So, as a soldier, he was put to the task of going to the front. He was there at Normandy in a jeep or a truck with a loudspeaker saying, "You can surrender and go back to your families. You can surrender and go back to your families." And then, of course, they would shoot to wherever the sound came from. So after a couple of weeks, he explained to his superiors, if you keep doing this, you're going to have to train somebody else to do it every few weeks, because I'm not going to survive this. And he said, "What do you propose?" And this was how ingenious Si was. He said, "I have an idea." He made a flyer. He said, "Just drop these on the battlefront." And the flyer was instructions for how to surrender. He said, "Germans love following orders." And it was actually more successful than standing by the truck and speaking this thing. At that point, after Normandy, he was traveling all through Germany on the front, very dangerous assignments, and that's what eventually led him to Buchenwald, and it was there that he finally gave up. There's a picture we're not showing here of him just toasting with schnapps, like he went through the entire war drunk as a skunk, basically. But when he got to Buchenwald and saw the corpses, he said, "It's enough." And he turned himself into the VA, and he was bleeding internally, and it took months to come out of it, but he came through the war.
So Buchenwald, I mean, he was there just a few days after it was liberated, yes. So the prisoners were still there, and if you've seen pictures, which I've chosen not to show you, this evening. They are so deeply, deeply disturbing of the survivors. We're talking not even of all of the people killed. And in his unfinished autobiography, Lewen wrote a little bit about that moment, and I'm just going to quote from it. "More and more inmates began to surround me as I tried to make my way around the camp. They looked more like skeletons than living human beings. The real horrors of war cannot be imagined and cannot be described. Hell, it's a fine poetic metaphor, but the Holocaust is beyond all description, comprehension, and belief. And so generation after generation parade off into war, not ever knowing what they parade into. It's a mindless slaughter and a foul, stinking, bloody mess."
So while he was in the VA hospital, actually even while he was on the front, he was conjuring up an idea for a book, having been exposed to this guy I mentioned, and I will mention again soon, named Mazariel, who was making these stories in pictures, woodcuts. Very powerful, very cinematic in their own weird way. In fact, when Thomas Mann was asked what his favorite movie was, he cited one of Mazariel's books as his favorite movie. So in the VA hospital, he began thinking about and working on this book, and he finished the book in about, 1951, at which point a friend of his, Lottie Jacoby, who was a photographer, who was a good friend of Einstein's. She took the photograph that you're looking at here. And he was enamored of the book and wrote a letter to Si, a fan letter, saying, well, basically, it's often been said that art should not be used to serve any political or otherwise practical goals, but I would never agree with this point of view. It is true that it is utterly wrong and disgusting if some direction of thought and expression happens is forced upon the artist from the outside. But strong emotional I can't read from this angle. Tendencies of the artist himself have often given birth to truly great works of art. One has only to think of Swift's Gulliver's Travels and Daumier's immortal drawings directed against corruption in French politics at the time. Our time needs you and your art. And it's more true now even than it was back in 51. 53, Lottie Jacoby, who had a gallery right across from where the MoMA is now, showed the parade. It was very well received. It led to a book version of it in 1957. That's a photo of Si at the time, also taken by Lottie Jacoby. So now I've been telling you about this guy, Mazariel. This is what led to me and Si finding each other. I was doing a project called Wordless because I wanted to understand how come there's this whole genre of books. It looked like comics to me, and I never had any pejorative ideas about comics. I loved them. In fact, I was a slob snob. For a long time, I'd only look at it if it was on newsprint. I wasn't interested in canvas or anything like that, you know? So Mazariel was the person who kind of reinvented this form based on medieval woodblock books, and this is like a book called The Idea, with a self-portrait of Mazariel over here, and it's a book in which he has no ideas in the first picture, then full-blown a muse comes out of his head. That's two in a row. And then later in the book, the muse escapes and is running through the city, and she ends up with images of her everywhere, and they're in books, so they begin to burn the books. Because this is, of course, the beginning of fascism, just to remember where we are in 2023. And then they burn the books, but she escapes and has a whole story with it. Ends up with him mourning her because she hasn't come back, and then it's kind of a weird ending, but it's a great book because of the rhythms of it. At the end, he gets another muse to come out of his head, but this one's a blonde, and I guess it's a cycle of a sort. But the pictures are incredibly powerful. He did a lot of books like this. It's based on his being a pacifist, an anti-war intellectual, and an activist who escaped from Belgium to Switzerland where he could work. And those books were released at very, very inexpensive prices and became very influential during the 20s and inspired other artists like the other ones I was listing that I was talking about in Wordless. Now, my puzzle was another one of the artists, this guy named Lind Ward, who's an American, was inspired by the book within a year of seeing it. He had been a student in Germany. He made his own Wordless novel called God's Man. It's the first one that was published in English, And it took America by storm because they hadn't seen any of the Masriel books that were all over Europe. And the result of that was it was taken very, very seriously. This was an important new medium that had been invented. And when I was reading about this, was going, this is weird. Like, it's being given a lot of attention in the culture and book pages. But a few pages after, there are all these comics, and everybody thinks of those with great contempt. What's up here? And why is this being taken seriously? So it took some thinking and digging, but I have a kind of explanation. There was a German troublemaker, a guy named Gotthold Lessing, and in the 1700s, he was a philosopher and a playwright who wrote a controversial book called Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry. And he distinguishes how words function and how pictures function. Looking at this statue, he says, well, gee, so Laocoon's being strangled by these snakes, and if you read the Aeneid, he's described as shrieking in agony. But if you look at his face here, this isn't Lessing's words. Basically, he looks like he just passed gas. It doesn't look like he's shrieking in agony. Why is this? And it says because in a narrative, in words, this is an important idea, I think, because it actually had a large impact for centuries after the Renaissance until recently, which is when you use words, you can have very different temporal events. Words naturally move through time. So you can be shrieking in agony here and be heroic there and have many facets. That's how words function. And so poetry, words, therefore moving through time and telling stories. Pictures don't do that well. Pictures should be pregnant moments, the essence of the story. So if you want to tell the story of Adam and Eve, you got Adam, you got Eve, you got a snake, you got an apple, you got the pearly gates behind them at the gates of Eden, and you have the whole picture encapsulated in one moment that can be a beautifully composed moment. That's okay, I guess, but then he said, pictures shouldn't tell stories, stories shouldn't try to describe landscapes. It's somehow, to me, very German as a rigid classification, but it had a lot of influence, and it relegated images to second place, in a sense, in terms of how they can function as pictures. So I just thought that's weird, because for me, I always thought comics were a medium of self-expression, and they were in a certain context. They were there to help sell newspapers, I suppose, and to entertain people. And when one wanted to transcend that, it was very hard to pass through the contract of having a communicative value to a picture, because he didn't want words and pictures commingling. It was unkosher, Lessing thought. And comics did that, of course, and they moved through time to tell a story. But ultimately, the stories by Lind Ward, who I mentioned, Masriel, and a number of other people, managed to do it by making one pregnant moment after another, usually on the right-hand side of a page, then a left hand with nothing on it, and then the next pregnant moment that happens to take place 8 seconds after. So he'd found a loophole in the Lessing contract that was allowing us to be looked at as pictures and also have the pleasures and the impact of telling a story in pictures. The thing about comics, see, which was a problem for me, is comics were always a second-hand creature in the world of art because they were seen as being primarily for kids. They were seen as dangerous for kids. This is a comic book burning from 1948 in Binghamton, where I went to college till I was kicked out. And it's basically, in the wake of the McCarthy era, I think that the liberals wanted their own chance to go crazy. So they decided that comics were the cause of much evil, that they caused juvenile delinquency, that they corrupted morals in youth and taught you not to read well because of the way words were used in comic books. And it created a kind of hysteria that led to comic book hearings and a self-censorship that was imposed on comic book publishers if they wanted to be distributed at all. And some of the greatest comics that I was able to find in back issue stores were the ones that had been censored out of existence and which really formed me. So this is the kind of comic book that would be censored. And Most people saw this and thought it was horrible. The psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, who led this anti-comic crusade, who was a good egg in a way, said, "This is horrible. It's a medium unlike any other. This has never been done before to show somebody having their eyes poked out like that." And I'm wondering about him because he was well read, and he must have read Oedipus at some point. But nevertheless, comic books got blamed for that. And I look at a picture like this and say, it talks to the power of comics. They can burn their way through the eyes into the brain and communicate very directly. So for me, it was an ideal metaphor. But by the time I was growing up, to be an adult reading comics was just to be the equivalent of a moron. People just saw them as low trash for children and unsophisticated adults. But as I can show you in this scientific chart, ever since the late 1980s, comics got to be taken seriously. You see, earlier people saw comics as low trash, but as you can see here, ever since the late 1980s,
Should I turn again?
yes, I know I had something to do with the change, but now comics could be read as a sign of being cool by adults. A sophisticated medium at last where cartoonists could even get dates. It used to be, when I was starting out as a comics artist, it was like, ooh, you're not even a plumber, it's like as low down on the food chain as you could get. So as a result of Mao's and the aforementioned Raw magazine, I've heard myself called as a father of the graphic novel, but I'm still demanding a blood test. I prefer the word comics or comics to mix words and pictures together. It just seems to embrace its past and allow things to happen that now has sort of allowed on occasion museums to lower their bar and ignore the Lessing dictum and have words and pictures commingled. It's hard to show comics well on a wall, but it's possible. And I'm hoping that someday there'll be even comics departments in museums the same way there are film departments. So, Si and I saw eye to eye when we met and got along really swell. And I went to visit him when he said, yes, you can use it, but you can't pay me. So I went to visit him and spend time with him in this rather, in a way, luxurious condo on a Quaker old age home compound. One bedroom was his bedroom and his bedroom with his wife. The other bedroom was a studio, just like any other artist's studio in Soho where I lived, except a little smaller. But it allowed him to really work and explore things in a way that was kind of uncanny. That beautiful period of post-impressionism, which he was getting a lot of success for, as it passed, he said, black came back into my palette. It's just part of what I experienced in life. And the pictures became vehemently anti-war, like this picture called The Grand Feast that I think Nina has in her house, Si's daughter. And it's an imposing, giant, impressive picture of cannibalism. And a lot of other pictures that were like this giant death head. Each one of these squares is about a foot high, I believe, so it's a very large picture. It was after he saw that art wasn't a commodity, because as soon as he started doing this, galleries were trying to tell him to go back to the ones that could sell. He wasn't interested, and he didn't want to stick to one style, which is, any of you wannabe painters, find one thing and stick to it. Like coffee cups would be fine. Just, you can paint them, you can sculpt them, you can stack them up and spray paint them, or put plaster of Paris around them, but stick to one thing, because then you've got a product you can sell. He wasn't interested in product. He was interested in self-expression, just like I was. Here, he had all these pictures that weren't selling, so he could cut them apart and use them any way he wanted. So these things are collaged from bits of other pictures, and with paint added in, like there's one little 1 foot square, and here's that square 1 foot by 1 foot, and he began composing a large series called Ecce Homo, which had a full rainbow of the expressions that he had to rid himself of, his life work as a kind of death mask. And ultimately, that led to, like I said, the parade and many other works that did something very specific. I told you that he wanted the pictures to be closer together so they could talk to each other. I took that to heart because that was a really interesting concept. So when we did our version of the book, it was the director's cut. We took the pictures that hadn't been put in by the original publisher, talked about where they would go and what they would be because they were expanding the book in a useful way. And I said, what about if we make this book like an accordion fold book, like a really long accordion fold book, so all the pictures talk to each other, and you can spread it out over a wall or a floor if you want to. He loved the idea. My partner in crime, my co-conspirator, Charlie Kochman from Abrams' book, loved it, although it took a long time for me to explain how a book like this could be done. When I made the maquette, I realized the problem was there was a lot of wasted paper on the back of this accordion fold, and my father taught me never to waste paper because he had been through the camps himself, and you don't waste anything. So on the back, I had to write a whole monograph about the rest of his life and work as best I could. So it's a two-sided book that has both things happening in it. As a way of putting it forward. Because,
Go ahead.
No.
So I'll just make a pitch. We have signed copies of the book in the bookstore, which will be open after this talk. But let's just take a pause now and talk about, you take a drink, and talk about his interest in seriality, which is something that's so important for you and your work as well. But this idea of how using visual means, artists over time have been able to tell a story across time in triptychs, for example, that he would have seen in museums in Germany, or when he was in New York, when he would visit a museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he would see this work by Botticelli from around 1500, which shows various scenes sequentially with the same person represented multiple times.
Gotthold Lessing would be turning over in his grave, I tell you, because here's Saint Zenobius in 3 different scenes doing 3 different miracles in the same space, basically, but in 3 different times. All of it involving resurrecting the dead. But in the right-hand one, what's really cool is a woman who died without having been given the last rites is brought back to life when Zenobius sprays her with some holy water. He then takes the holy water out to where her corpse is put, sprays it again, and then she gets up, she can get baptized, and it's one more miracle. So it's 3 with 3 on top of each other coming forward in the right-hand side. It's a very complex mixing of time and space that allows a story to be unpacked.
And Si was really interested in that, right? So he created all sorts of triptychs like this one. And he was using art from different periods of time. He was combining them together in a single work. And then he did something very interesting, which is another kind of triptych.
Yeah, a stacked triptych. But what it was it allowed him to keep changing styles. He said style was suffocating him, that thing of having to stick to one thing as opposed to see what you're feeling, what you're making. And since he wasn't interested in it as a commodity, some of these things were really astonishing. It's hard to know which ones were made in the past, which ones were made when he was working on that triptych, and began to work on long chains of pictures. Mazriel was his guide, but also in a sense mine. This was a sketchbook in the early 70s that I had on the left, being inspired by Mazriel to put all the pictures on one page so I could make a joke out of it, which was my notion of what to do with a story when I was younger. And ultimately, the drawing style itself had a lot of impact on me because they had the boldness of cartoons, but they also had a kind of gravitas, as did a number of the other artists I admired, like George Grosz, Max Beckmann, and others. And ultimately, I only realized this when I was looking back on it now for this talk, it really influenced even the drawing of Maus. It's done with very bold lines, kind of more like woodcut than delicate little feathered pen lines, and has a lot of chaos of black and white that resolve themselves quickly, but are very black and white. And that can be seen even here. And it was because when I was making Maus, this is a woodcut, but when a scratchboard drawing imitating a woodcut. But when I was drawing Maus, I was drawing it the same size as you see it, because that meant that it had more of an I-thou relationship with the reader than if I worked big, reduced it, and made it look better than it was. And it was a way of trying to find a cross between a typeface and handwriting. And so it was the same size that I drew it that you got to see. And it led and was convenient to use the bluntness of Mazriel's usually very small woodcuts. This was another inspiration of Mazriel when I was invited to draw funnies for Playboy. And my problem again is that I like to have multiple pictures butting up against each other, and I'm very interested in seeing what happens between the boxes. So it wasn't typical of the Playboy style, but I made it work for them. But For Si, it was important to find these ways of keeping things serial because he was very prolific and wanted to keep moving at all times. This was a series called...
Trail.
Thank you, Trail. I think it's about 8 or 10 pictures that looked like these. And as far as he was concerned, it should start with a black solid picture that was 4 feet by 4 feet, like these were. And it should end with a black fading to red. In the middle, there were all these bits of clothing floating in the wind. And they were quite beautiful, the tonalities of these things, more than you can see in a photograph of it. But his idea was you could face any way was north, whichever way you put it was fine, your choice, and you could choose what picture in what order for all the pictures between the black and the red. And I said, what were you thinking about when you were doing this, Si? And he says, well, you know, I asked people what they thought, and he said, most of them thought it was about sex. Me, I thought it was about Auschwitz, but, you know, you can choose yourself. So I thought Si's use of pictures moving through time and space was a much more sophisticated approach to what comics had to offer than, say, Roy Lichtenstein. This was a review I did of an important show at the MoMA in 1990 called High Art, Low Culture, which was a terrible pairing. And what happened was the paintings always won the wall because the comics were just put in little vitrines and very few of them. And oddly enough, the catalog was won by the comics because they were made for print. But there are ways to show comics and give them presence. I was always especially peeved at Roy Lichtenstein because all Roy Lichtenstein was doing was he was using comics. He was using comics to find a way out of the terrible cul-de-sac of abstract expressionism. I'm not making a drawing of a person, I'm just making a drawing of a person and showing you how mechanistic mass culture and art is. So the brush line is made thoroughly mechanical, the no Rubenesque flesh tones here, just big dots. And I don't know, I felt it was very condescending to comics because it never was homage to Jack Kirby or any of the artists that he was taking panels from, blowing up and adjusting the compositions of. It was just done by somebody anonymous and irrelevant. And as far as I was concerned, it was useful to put words and pictures together in a canvas. Maybe that's as much as he could offer, but really, he did no more for comics than Andy Warhol did for soup. The one picture I found that I was interested in a book of interviews with Lichtenstein was this picture. I'm going, wow, this is actually moving through time, and I wanted to find a reference to it somewhere in the book. He had no interest in the fact that it was 2 moments of time. He was also a bum artist drawing the same foot, whether it was pushing on the pedal or all the way down. But nevertheless, what he did was show 2 units of time, and he was only interested in the pattern, not in the fact of it. And to me, it's that temporal jump that allows painting to move in areas that it hadn't been free to move in since the centuries earlier, where it was just part of triptychs and serial paintings and whatever, where time and space could mix. So he did many of these series. One of the things that's to me kind of tragic is right now Si's work is mostly being warehoused in not the best of conditions, because when you think art is priceless and therefore worthless, he didn't focus on making money at all. He focused on making paintings. He did a series of paintings that I'm very intrigued by. This is I think about 2,000 paintings or so, each of them 2 feet by 4 feet, and it was called The Procession, and it was specifically inspired by the parade. Each of these is a figure. He made thousands of them, 2,000 I guess, about. And his point was to be able to make these figures and put them in any order you want, except some of them would be in clusters and they'd be indicated to try to keep these 3 together. And you could make a cluster of 3 to 12, let's say, and then have a black or red panel between and do another cluster. So you could be essentially, if you were the curator of the show, you'd be participating in it with invitation to be the film editor. Because you can make different things from these various moods of works done over a period. Started this in the early 50s, stopped only when he put down his brushes in about 2014 or so. And when talking about his work, he says, my work is grounded in history beyond the contemporary. Its main source of relationship is the medieval multi-panel altars as well as the modern cinema. What both have in common is the dimension of time. This dimension is basic to my work. From my graphic novels, a phrase he hadn't known, but okay, but he did know mouse, I wasn't calling it a graphic novel either, to the triptychs, ultimately to the procession series consisting of over 2,000 panels and still growing. I want to see it, and it's just stacked somewhere. And he hasn't even ever seen it because he just kept making it but didn't know how to put together that many feet of paintings. So it's one of his many
many great works. So
Yes.
speaking of stacks of artwork, when Art took me to see some of this work, one of the stacks that I saw was a series called The Ghosts. So these are about 3 feet tall, 3.5, 3 to 4 feet.
It's 2 by
tall.
4, just like the procession.
And they're ghosts, they're memories, and they're all different. Every bad image that I'm showing you tonight, if it's really bad, like this one, it means I took it, and I never thought I would show it to an audience, so I apologize. But just to give you a sense of the scale, there's Art showing them to me, and I was just so amazed. Some of them are double-sided, some of them are single-sided. They're meant to be just hung up with clothespins, and they are evocative, and when you know his life history, they become even that much more, they take on an even different context. And there are many of these, and they're really extraordinary. This is just a very small
The first ones
section.
were done for the documentary on the Ritchie boys, the special ops force that I was telling you about, because the director wanted him to paint because the other Ritchie boys weren't artists. But he says, "You took me here, there's no canvas, there's no paints, how am I going to paint for you?" And then he solved it by buying some burlap and some charcoal, going back to the most primitive way of doing it, and he made the first ghost. And I just learned today that he took that one eventually and turned it sideways and turned it into a landscape, but he was still haunted by ghosts. And it led to him working on the series from 2008 till about 2014. The problem was, they were very haunting, really very haunting. He gave me one, I could choose. I took an early one of the ghosts. I had it in my studio, and eventually I had to move it into the hallway because it was just too unnerving, you know. He was haunted by ghosts, and it spread from those canvases outward. But at a certain point, he was trying to work, and you can see a bandage on his right arm there. He had this crippling rheumatism, and he didn't know what to do about it. It was getting harder and harder to hold a brush. He would try to paint through it, but he couldn't. And finally, he couldn't stand anymore. He couldn't even cut the canvases to make more of these ghost bits of canvas to paint on, so he just started painting on the back and doubled his quantity by using the backs of these things. And they would get to be expressive. There's one little run of them that are just funny ghosts. He said, "You can make friends with the ghosts," you know. But here, he didn't know what to do, and one night he did this horrible thing. He took the saw that he used for making his stretchers, and he applied it to his hand in the condo that he was living in. And he wrote the word "enough" on the wall, and just tried to stop the pain by cutting his hand off. They found him the next morning. He was still alive, and the doctor said, "Sonny, you never seemed crazy, but at this point I think I should put you in a mental hospital." He said, "It's just I didn't calculate how hard bone was. I just wanted to stop it from hurting." And in a weird way, he did this operation on himself that sort of worked. He couldn't paint with his hand anymore, but it stopped the pain. Then for a while he was glum because he didn't know how to paint with his other hand and stuff. And then I get a call from him, and he's so enthusiastic. He says, "Do you have to come down to Gwynnedd right away and see what I'm making?" I said, "What is it?" He says, "It's an installation." With that mystery. And what it is he managed to make out of plaster and clay hands coming up from the ground in his studio. And it was really chilling to see this thing coming up from the dead. But nothing could really, he was indefatigable as an artist. And as a result, when they moved him into a smaller facility, he said, "I put down my paintbrushes, I can't paint anymore." But then he'd come back into the little hospital room he was in, and it was covered with scrawls, pictures, handprints that he was making on the walls of this hospital room, just because he was indefatigable as an image maker.
Okay, just 1 second, we're gonna get the audio going. I think I'm in the wrong
So this is
key,
when
but-
I brought the book to him. Let me just speak for a second. I brought the book to him as the first copy off a boat from China. I got down to Gwynnedd, pulled the book out and give it to him, and it was like awe. He was looking at it, he says, "I can't believe." And he says, "Look, I want to look at both sides at once. I don't know which side to look at first." And it's like an accordion that's just falling into his lap. And at some point I said, "Charlie couldn't come with me, and he's responsible for this thing happening as well. So could you just tell Charlie how you feel about this?" So with my bad little iPhone, I managed to turn it into a 30-second clip that we'll play if...
Charlie, this is really quite something. I didn't expect it to be quite so calm and unusual and beautiful. It's what I always dreamt. Maybe someday it will come through. Now it has, and I'm grateful. This is really...
There we go.
So I am very proud of my collaborations with Si. He died 10 days after he got this book. And as his daughter said, he had permission to die now. He's 98. And as an atheist, he was eager to meet Rennie again, his wife. So the thing was, I was then in France, and I was trying to call the obit part of the New York Times to make sure he got an obituary of some kind. And evidently, there's a lot of conversation. I found out from some friends at the time much later that they just said, but he wasn't an important influence on the 20th century. And I said, well, I wish I was there to talk to him about it, because of course he wasn't. He was absorbing the entire 20th century, doing postmodernism before it was invented, and becoming an important philosopher of art and maker of art for the 21st century. And that's why it was so important to make the book and present it. And I'm grateful to Rebecca and to Kelly for bringing it here. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. The exhibition Si Lewen, The Parade, will be on view here at the Menil Drawing Institute through September 3rd. We invite you after this talk to go over to the Drawing Institute, where we'll keep the galleries open so you can see the show. But I think in a miraculous turn of events, we have time for a few questions.
Amazing.
So Tony has a microphone, so if you would like to ask a question, we ask that you wait for the mic so he can give it to you so that we can all hear your question. So if you do have a question for Art, please raise your hand. And if you're down in a hallway, you might actually have to yell in addition to raising your hand. No questions?
Oh.
Mr. Spiegelman, hello. I know that you saw the Poor Richard drawings by Philip Guston recently. Maybe you could talk about Guston and those drawings?
Yes, my favorite artist these days. I was flabbergasted when I started finding out that he was capable of triggering an entire generation of snowflakes, not understanding that those Klan drawings were built on the profound scar that they left on him, the Klan, as World War II did on Si, because, you know, Jews were not much better than blacks back in the day, and were definitely a victim of Klan hatred. The Poor Richard drawings were, to him, a sign of America's decline by having Nixon for a president. If he had lived a little bit longer, I can't imagine what he would do with Trump. But I can tell you that the Klan drawings are not like some kind of little circus of like, oh, I can get a little shiver from people. They were actually built on the profundity of evil that's at the same time so evil that it's comic. And it was also identifying himself with the Klan. On my iPhone, my homepage is his self-portrait. Never mind, you won't be able to see it from there anyway. It's him in a Klan suit with a cigarette painting a Klansman. So he had to understand that introjection. He was understanding that evil is everywhere, including inside himself, and it was a way of showing the gravity of the crimes. But the way they showed it in Boston was to take what was meant to be probably a chronological show, because he famously had several periods in his life. The early period where even in his early 20s he showed himself off to be a young Renaissance master born a few centuries after the Renaissance. Those drifted into becoming, toward abstraction. His high school buddy Jackson Pollock had gotten to New York before he did, but Guston met him there a few years later and found himself teetering toward abstraction and finally just going full bore and was accepted as one of the great abstract artists of his moment. But then he got restless and began moving away from expressionism, having almost a face or a figure in it, but still somehow seeming abstract, unless you really knew what you were looking for in that picture. It reminds me, I'm sorry to make it longer, but I have so much to think about with Guston. Just last week I was down to see the Washington exhibit that was actually chronological and was really the better for it ultimately, even though I loved seeing all of his work mixed together, like the early period, middle, and late, because it just proves that it was one artist all along, the same hand, the same brush marks doing all this stuff. But when he's making these almost abstract but inching back toward realism pictures, you can sort of see that there's a head in there somewhere, and then it becomes this large black shape that wasn't part of his abstraction before. It reminded me of when I was in junior high school. I would draw these women's torsos in the margins of the paper I was taking notes on, and then I'd always have the same realization daily: crap, if they take this notebook to look at what I've been taking notes on, I'm going to get in trouble. So I'd always take this torso and change the breasts into eyes, the V of her crotch into a nose, and then make it look sort of like the arms would become ears, and make little puppy dogs, as if I was just totally obsessed with cartoon dogs. And he couldn't repress it. He had to go back to figuration, because as he famously said, I can't sit in my studio adjusting a red to a blue with the world in the shape that it's in. And it brought him back into narrative picture making in a way that now just seems like, well, it's the punchline to abstract expressionism. It has all of the energy, the same palette that he worked with before, but stunningly returning back to his comic book and cartoon roots. He was given a cartoon mail order course. It had him, when he was 13 years old, joining a cartoon club that was getting cartoons printed in the Los Angeles newspaper. So very recently, when people realized he was born Philip Goldstein, not Philip Guston, there were these comic strips by Philip Goldstein, and by God, they were by him. And so he outgrew comics all too quickly, and when he was making his late paintings, he was lamenting because he was really being excommunicated from the art world. He was called by Hilton Kramer a Mandarin pretending to be a stumblebum. And he had to flee New York. He moved to Woodstock, was painting without a gallery, without many of the friends that were abstract expressionists that thought of him as a heretic, and was doing it because it's what he needed to do, because art wasn't a commodity for Guston either. And it was a way of making these cartoon drawings in one book. One thing that became a book, Poor Richard, which you were asking about, it was the gang of thugs that included Kissinger and Agnew and Nixon. Nixon was just drawn as a dick with stubbly scrotum for his cheeks, and they were drawings that kind of echoed Crazy Cat by George Harriman in their drawing style. And I think he realized he had gone too far, because a certain kind of comics drawing makes something happen that's kind of weird, which is words and narrative can eat the pictures. And it's hard to find the balance. And I think that that's an interesting thing of what Si did in his work, which showed and demonstrated a way to make picture narratives that didn't get eaten by the narrative. Long answers, this is the problem.
We have time for another question.
Hello. So, pages from comics by yourself, by R. Crumb, Will Eisner, Frank Miller, these are the kind of comics that are on the walls of museums. Why do you think it is that comics that lean more literary get this sort of recognition? And do you think Ernie Bushmiller and Booty Rogers could ever get that sort of appreciation?
Yes. Once the barrier has been broken, that thing of showing you the how people were perceived to look at comics back till 1985 or so, when a lot of the artists you just mentioned flowered and demoed a different kind of possibility for comics, even if it had to be called graphic novels, which I thought was a terrible phrase, but what do I know about marketing? I just thought they should be called I wanted to make a long comic book that needed a bookmark and asked to be reread, but it's not as good a phrase as graphic novels for attracting attention. It was inspired by calling those woodcut novels novels and woodcuts, and it's what gave Eisner the idea of calling his book a graphic novel when he made a bunch of short stories hoping there was an audience for such things. But the thing is, it's always been flirting with museums, and museums have been flirting with comics for a while now, but it's never been a done deal, you know? There's a moment with that high-low show and followed by a Masters of the Comics show that traveled around where it was being taken seriously, and it was interesting, but it was interesting to see how difficult it was to show comics in a museum. It takes real thinking of how to do that, to mix. Are you showing the original? Is the original the printed newsprint page? Is the original the drawing that led to a color, black and white drawing that led to a color page? How much of it do you have to show to give a sense of it? And those things are still being figured out. And I'm interested in seeing where it all lands because it has room there. What's surprising is, for me, that at a certain point, it just seemed to me, why aren't comics being taken seriously? They're so evocative. I first realized it when I was in 4th grade and saw a little classmate of mine, a girl, crying while reading a romance comic. And it had never occurred to me that a comic book could make somebody cry, even if it's not a profound comic book. But it did indicate that there's a much broader spectrum than just superheroes and jokes. And that seemed more and more clear to me, and it means it needed to be studied on its own and take the people who really were very ambitious. What's amazing to me is how quickly, in a sense, without trying very hard, the barriers of the word part, the literature part of comics, those barriers fell without too much fight. You know, bookstores are filled with comics. They're taught in universities at this point as graphic novel courses. Bookstores, it's one of the only real growing sections in bookshops to see all of these picture books now. It just happened. Museums have a different culture, art museums, and it's a long answer because I have so much to say on this subject. I apologize, but the thing is, I have writer friends. They all believe it's fine if you say, "What were you communicating in your book?" to talk about. And of course they say, "Well, if I could tell you shorter, I would just have written it shorter." But it's about this and that. They don't get pissy about the fact that you said they were communicating. Painters tend to be really angry when you say that they're communicators, because it's like, it means it's commercial art if it's communicating something. So they act like shamans, and they leave their entrails, their guts, out for you to look at and divine what the shaman means. This is a recent use for art, because back in the Renaissance and before, it was fine if art had meaning. Like you were trying to express meaning. You were trying, picture windows in churches were all meant to be read, you know. For people who couldn't read, they'd get the story, the greatest story ever told, with a superhero who could walk on water and turn it into wine, all that shit. And ultimately, they just didn't have newsprint, but it was a way of telling. And somehow, as photography came to be, artists were beginning to look around, what do we do if we're not trying to make representations? It led to other kinds of art where less and less of it was about communicating. It was really about something else. And to me, I sometimes think it was all about non-fungible tokens, but that's a cynical thing.
Well, I did not think we would say the words non-fungible tokens at this talk, but I think maybe that's a great place to end. Thank you all for being here. As a reminder, the Menil Drawing Institute is open. We were all invited to the reception. If you would prefer or want to stop at the bookstore first, it will be open till 8 o'clock. And thanks to the curator of this exhibition, Kelly Montana, and to our... to Si Lewen's family, and also to Art Spiegelman. Thank you all for coming.